Good evening, History of Christianity students. This is Doc Matthews. I'm recording this in the 12 by 20 electricity-free firelit shack that I call my research home because it's where pretty much everybody leaves me alone and the only place that I can really focus on the joys of reading Greek at my leisure. Tonight's lecture is on the worship and organization of the early church. You can see pretty much where I'm coming from in interpreting this by the subtitle. It is a transformation of Jewish worship. We'll talk about that a bit more in subsequent slides, but I want to encourage you at this point, since this is a recorded lecture and you don't have the opportunity to ask direct questions, to have note paper beside you and write down your questions, your comments, things you want to challenge me about. I'm going to be going over just a very general overview here, so you know the challenge I have for you. When we see each other again in class, when we have a chance to discuss the material under consideration, challenge me. Ask me about my sources. Ask me how I know. I'll be mentioning some things along the way, but in a recorded lecture there isn't time for going into great detail on the source material which informs the lecture itself. There is a lot of discussion currently and in the past. It kind of stems from the 19th century in German universities. There's a lot of discussion in scholarly literature about different regional varieties in the early Christian movement. Most of these are conjectural. We have to raise some questions about whether there were, in the first century particularly, whether there were enough Christians to have any particular major variation from one group to the next. So I'm going to be challenging that a bit. How many Christians were there in the first century? Well, it's impossible to get an absolutely reliable figure. We just don't have any way of knowing. They didn't tick little boxes when they went to the law courts saying, yup, Christian. The category barely existed, and Roman society, of course, didn't work that way. But the sociologist Rodney Stark has a pretty good estimate, in my opinion, of how Christianity must have grown to achieve the numbers we're pretty sure it had by the 4th century, and that would place the number at the turn of the 1st century, about the year 100, at something about 8,000 Christians. Okay. If Stark is right then, and it's a pretty good number just from statistical work that he's done elsewhere, if Stark is right, then there were considerably fewer Christians than there would have to be to have a tremendous variation among, and it's certainly communities that didn't communicate with each other, which is the assumption of these 19th century German scholars. Hold on to that thought. We'll be coming back to it at other times throughout the course. We do have to recognize, just from available evidence, that there were variations in worship style in the 1st century from what little we know. There were certainly variations in language. We know the Syriac church, the church in Syria, spoke Syriac. We know that the church in Asia Minor spoke Greek, and those things have to be considered. Customs varied across the empire. They would with the Christian communities as well. And to some degree, governance. I'm less certain that there was a whole lot of variance in governance the more I think about the structure of early Christianity and how it relates to Second Temple Judaism. I'll get back to that. But I want to point out that if we're going to draw any conclusions about the variations in early Christianity, they track pretty well, I think, from the available texts, and we talk about the texts in class, and we'll talk about them more very soon. They track fairly well with the type of variety you find among the synagogue communities, both at home in Judea and throughout the diaspora. The reality that Christianity spread through the Jewish synagogue networks helps us understand why this is reasonable, and why our vision when we start looking at the texts of a variation which matches fairly closely the variations in Judaism is pretty realistic. But truth to tell, as you know from being in this class, we don't have much evidence to go on beyond a handful of texts which are clearly representative of one region. So although we can extrapolate backward from little snippets in uh, in letters to, for instance, Paul's letter to the Romans, and in Clement of Rome's letter, there's not much. It's a lot of conjecture. Where we do have evidence is from Judea, and particularly Syria also. And this comes from the New Testament itself, the early documents, and from the Didache, which we are also studying in class. For the most part, it is reasonable to recognize, as I've mentioned before, that there were variations which reflected the variations of diaspora Judaism at the time. While there was clearly a range of acceptable thought and emphases in theology at the turn of the 2nd century, there are no recognizable divisions over doctrine, no divisions into clear-cut Christian groups, with one notable exception, that would be distinct from one another. The only divisions that are there are hypothesized by scholars, and they're hypothesized by scholars who don't particularly take into account the small size that Christianity had to have at the turn of the 1st century, and they don't particularly take into account the type of diversity that is permissible within a movement. So I'm not particularly fond of saying there were numerous Christianities in the 1st century. That's not remotely accurate. What I want to suggest, and I will defend in class when you challenge me, there is text evidence for debate in the early Christian communities. They are debating many things. You see this in the New Testament. Peter and Paul are in the midst of a debate over just how certain Jewish traditions should be maintained or abolished based on Christian teaching. So the debates are there. You see these throughout the New Testament. You see these in the Didache. I've argued that the Didache is evidence of several documents being strung together that are one half of a conversation over debated issues. And sure, there can be debate. We have debate in our class. We have a class of under 60 people, and we debate issues. But that doesn't mean that we aren't focused on one topic. And with a movement that's united not around the hope of getting a passing grade, like our class will be, but a movement that's united around a common ideology, a common preaching, a kerygma, a proclamation that they've all agreed on is correct, there's just not going to be a lot of radical diversity. There was one significant group in the 1st century which can be said to be a distinct variety of Christianity, and that group is known as the Ebionites. They claimed to be the true followers of Christ, and they denied that he was either God or divine. As you've already seen, contrary to some strange popular literature and scholars who should know better, such as Bart Ehrman, the evidence from the book of Mark shows that Jesus was clearly either claimed to be divine by the author of the book of Mark, or he was guilty in the serious way of blasphemy. After all, no one can forgive sins but God alone, and then Jesus goes and forgives sins and lets the question hang, implying that this guy is considerably more than your average rabbi. But the Ebionites didn't follow these texts. They may have had their own sets of texts, and how coherent this group was is hard to say. They were tiny at best, but we know they existed. They were probably centered in Palestine and were an extreme minority. If the early church, or if the early Christians numbered less than 8,000, you can't have too many Ebionites existing, since most of them held to the mainline views as far as we can tell. The Ebionites may represent elements of the larger circle of Jesus' followers, people who knew about Jesus of Nazareth, but who didn't adapt their beliefs to the teachings of the so-called apostles, who did not adjust their thinking to the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, who simply say, I remember that guy and he taught this, and they kept up their own tradition. None of those that are described as associated with the inner circle of followers, described in Mark, the so-called 12, None of them can be easily connected to this group. I don't think you're going to have the Ebionites being part of that particular mainline form of Christianity. They did fade from existence quite rapidly, possibly as a result of the destruction of the temple. After all, if Jesus is not divine, and hold this thought, there is no reason to say that the temple's unnecessary. You'd still need the temple, so after the temple's destroyed in 70 AD, the Ebionites fade away. They're replaced by a more mainline, what would eventually become a rabbinic Judaism. So hold the thought of the importance of the temple in Christianity, because we're going to get to that point within this. Now, you know, I am teaching a history course, and strange to say, a lot of people who claim to be writing histories of Christianity today aren't particularly historical in their approach. We've been over this in class. I'm going to introduce and intensify some of my discussion regarding the Jewish nature of Christianity in the following slides. So let's follow me. Let's take a little walk through my logic here. First of all, there is no question that Christianity grew primarily out of first century Judaism. Duh, everybody involved in the early movement was a member of the first century Jewish community. This should not be debated, but you'll see that it is. It was from the beginning a Jewish sect. This is the most reasonable reason, that the Romans don't take much notice of it until the 2nd century. It's just one small group of Jews that seems to have broken off from a larger group of Jews. And yes, some non-Jews have joined, but then non-Jews were joining Judaism all the time. So this is nothing that inherently sets it apart or raises it above the media threshold of anyone in Rome. Now, as I had hinted, the older I get and the more I read in Second Temple Judaism and the history of Christianity, the less tolerant I am of scholars who deny the Jewish nature of Christianity. As obvious as these first two facts are, there are scholars who proceed as if this simply isn't true. Even in very scholarly books and articles, it is common to see attempts to prevent early Christianity from looking too Jewish. Now, some of this may be anti-Semitism. I suggest it is. A great deal more of it, after my wearying years going to conferences and hearing some of this stuff, a great deal more of it, I think, is a refusal to embrace the type of variety of abilities that are required to study Christianity as a Jewish sect. You can't look at it as a Jewish sect if you don't know Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and to some degree the Latin of the empire. But that's a skill set that is not common, and in the 21st century those languages are fading fast, I have a feeling, from my own experience being trained in the late 20th century. There's a decline. There are two main sources of the problem, I think, of denying the connections with Second Temple Judaism and Christianity. The first is anti-Semitic scholarship. I have no other way of saying this, and if anyone listening is an Adolf von Harnack fan, I'm sorry, but I think he's caused a world of trouble for the scholarship of early Christianity by conjecturing all kinds of stuff, including varieties of communities that kind of sprung up spontaneously in Judea, that realistically, from a truly historical perspective, could not have existed. Particularly in the 19th century, liberal, note the quotation marks, that's because that's what they're called, one's taking a new direction, liberal scholars such as Adolf von Harnack went out of their way to portray early Christianity as completely separate from Judaism. I can't separate this trend. I'm passionate about this. I cannot separate this trend from the anti-Semitism that led to disastrous results in the 20th century. And that's why I have, for those of you who know or have either heard me guest lecturing in Holocaust class or have heard me in the hallway lecturing rather loudly at the request of students, I call him the first Adolf, the one who came out with a Christianity that needed no Jews in order to be made. Yes, Jesus was Jewish, but Jesus was portrayed as remarkably radical. By the way, in the background, you may hear my dog barking. She's contributing as well. No, actually, she's protecting me from the wolves, or that's how she sees things in her mind. I think the wolves are just not paying a whole lot of attention from their end. I do think, and you can look this up yourself or ask me about it further, Harnack was rebelling, Adolf von Harnack was rebelling against his dad, who was a fairly intensively well-trained scholar who focused on the Jewish nature of Christian religion in much of his writing. We'll ask Freud about that when we get the chance. Scholars trying to advance a denominational agenda have also pushed forward a very non-Jewish form of Christianity, such as Anabaptists denying that the early Christians had a formal clergy. Again, just hold that thought. I'll be addressing it in later slides. But this is a pretty harsh indictment of a lot of mainline scholars today who themselves, in their personal lives and their personal convictions or lack thereof, are neither particularly anti-Semitic nor particularly dogmatic. Someone like Bart Ehrman, you know, I respect his work, particularly his early work, but he is shockingly in line with Harnack on some particularly ahistorical issues. Now, Ehrman is neither a dogmatic Christian, nor is he an anti-Semite, but he does follow a tradition of scholarship which is begun for no good reason by those who wish to separate Judaism from Christianity. And I'd be happy to talk with him or any others further on the subject, but this line of scholarship just isn't going to work anymore. You'll notice that the textbook falls into the latter error, denying the early Christians had a formal clergy. They were just a simple group of people meeting in various houses, and there was no particular order to what they did. That's bizarre. Just because there's no order outlined in the New Testament, which, by the way, is not why any of the books in the New Testament were written, doesn't mean they didn't have a formal order. It was one that was so obvious that it wouldn't have to be stated, and there is evidence of this order in the Didache, which we will read in class, and there is evidence of this order in the writings of the New Testament itself, if they are read in the context of Second Temple Judaism rather than in isolation. And that's one of the biggest problems with reading the New Testament without some historical context, is you lose many of the cultural references to what was going on in the text that the folks at the time, being a small group of Second Temple Jews, simply wouldn't have had a problem with, or slightly post-Second Temple. A more historically sound approach is to look first to the similarities between early Christianity and Judaism to understand the origin of Christian teaching and practices. Let's compare and see what clearly carried over, because there are things, and we'll see this especially in the Didache, reading it together in class, there are things which definitely carried over. After this, the critical differences will become apparent. Once we know where the similarities are, we can see how Christianity differentiated itself. And again, this lecture will simply raise some of the ideas that we can pursue further in class and in primary source work. I'd like to begin by recalling what I'd brought up in an earlier lecture, that there are three particular places of Jewish worship. And my argument is that these were the original Christian places of worship. It's not my argument alone. This is pretty much how every Second Temple Jewish scholar, or scholar of Judaica, thinks of it. This is where simply how and where Christian worship began, because who they were Second Temple Jews in the original movement. So you have the three sacred spaces, each of which had its own ordered rituals. Jesus did not break away from these rituals. Jesus embraced most of these rituals, as we have already discussed in considering the Gospel of Mark, but it bears repeating because I wish to be challenged on that. If you think Jesus is more radical than I've portrayed him, if you think he's less Jewish than I've portrayed him, let's keep the conversation going. So the three places are the temple, the ultimate high place of Jewish worship, the synagogue, the place of the local community coming together, and the home, which is family worship, but it involves a great deal more than what we consider a nuclear family. It'll involve extended family, servants, whoever is part of the household, guests who may be brought over for special occasions. There are numerous points in the Gospels where it refers to Jesus being brought to somebody's house to eat. Now, that isn't just an evening meal. That's joining them in an evening ritual of fellowship, which was part of Jewish identity at the time of the early Christian movement. The function of each of these places, along with many elements of the formal ritual, or as it's often called, the liturgy — it's not quite the right use of the word liturgy, but it's how people use it today — the function of each of these places and the elements of the formal ritual was retained among the early Christians as much as possible. I don't believe there is any other way to read the early evidence, and I'll walk you through each of these places and some of the points along the way and explain why. What the Christians had to do eventually, and to some degree originally, was modify the traditional Jewish worship rituals and the traditional Jewish worship spaces in order to accommodate the differences that came with the Christian belief that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. When the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, and you could no longer, go to the temple for the regular temple function of your worship, the Christians had a modification, I believe, already in place, or they modified it very rapidly, that allowed them to shift the work of the temple or the role of the temple in their lives to the mystical presence of Jesus Christ himself. You also see changes in the belief that we saw in Mark, that Jesus is a divine Savior, that he is more than a human rabbi. And this is evident in how we'll see in the Didache, but we'll also talk about it in general outline here. This is evident in how the Christians consciously shifted away from their more traditional Jewish ancestry. So let's begin by talking about the temple. The temple in ancient Judaism was the place of the sacramental, and we'll go back to that again, but we've brought the concept up. Sacramental just means mysterious but real. The temple was the place of the sacramental or mysterious but real presence of the transcendent God on earth. It is where heaven met earth, if you recall, as we studied just the basics of Judaism. It's also the place of sacrifice, the one place designated in Judaism where the guilt of sins was removed through the slaughter of animals in a ritual way, and that slaughter of animals was to carry away the sins of the people for whom the animals were slaughtered. Speaking of animals, the dog going a bit crazy out here. The temple was also the place of community identity. For the Jews, Jerusalem was the center of the universe and the earthly source of their identity. The homeland was not just Judea, but it was centered in the holy city of Jerusalem. This was where they as a people met the God at the temple who had chosen them as his people. This is where the God of Israel interacted with his people. He is their God, he will dwell in their midst, he will be their God, they will be his people. Where he dwells in their midst is in the Jerusalem temple. While the temple was still standing, we know the sect of the Christians went there regularly. Acts 5:42 in the Christian scriptures talks about the meetings at the temple. The destruction of the temple probably did not hit the Christians as hard as it did other Jews, because the role of the temple had already been taken over by the person of Jesus Christ. That's my argument. I think that concept of Christ as temple predates the destruction of the temple. Others, the latest you can put it, even if you say they just quickly developed this doctrine to accommodate the fact that the temple was destroyed by Vespasian, this is definitely true by the time of 75 CE, that the Christian communities regarded Christ as having taken much of the place ritually of the temple. Christ was, in Christian thinking, first the new focus of the mysterious joining of heaven and earth. The God of heaven had become human. In the Gospel of John, written sometime at the close of the first, or some would say the beginning of the second century, Jesus repeatedly says that he is the temple, and the very first the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of John, the very first chapter of the Gospel of John identifies the Word, which is, as we've discussed, a name for the Christ, as tabernacling or tenting in the midst of the people, as in the Old Testament tabernacle. So the presence of God is found in Jesus, not in the temple. According to the Gospel of John and the book of Hebrews, both fairly late in the first century to be honest, Jesus is the sacrifice which ends all other sacrifice. He is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, John 1:29, and this certainly is not an isolated concept. This expands upon less explicit references such as Jesus' reference to his blood taking away sins, Matthew 26:28, that Last Supper bit, and then the Pauline letters, or the letters from the Apostle Paul, the letter to the Romans 5:9 and Colossians 1:20. There's a whole lot more. I'm cutting myself off there. Check it out if you want. Ask questions. We'll talk about it in class. The Christians themselves take on the identity of Christ himself, the new temple, as that which defines them for who they are. This is a strange idea, but the Christians saw themselves as mystically the body of Christ. They have put on Christ. According to Galatians 3:27, all those who are baptized in Christ have put on Christ like a garment. Therefore, Christians are also the temple because Christ is with them, and the language of Christ as temple became very prominent in early Christian worship, where Christ was believed to be mysteriously present. We'll be looking at that in, for instance, Hippolytus of Rome. We're still a century off from Hippolytus of Rome, but by then this concept of the mysterious presence of Christ is firmly established in Christian language. Let's consider in outline the second place of Jewish worship and how Christianity maintained, even more than modified, maintained the basic structure of what we find in the synagogue, the place of gathering, the place where people come together. The synagogue was the place of several things. I've enumerated them, but it's many more things than this. It is a local community center. It is where the business of everything takes place. If you're a local Jew not found in Jerusalem, even if you're in Jerusalem, there are little synagogues throughout Jerusalem in the first century where your community gathers, the local congregation. So it's a place of preaching and hearing the law of God, the reading of the scriptures. Recall, if you will, that during the Babylonian exile, which we discussed in a previous session, during the Babylonian exile, the need for local centers of maintaining Jewish identity, Jewish scripture, Jewish religion developed. These are the synagogues. It's the place of ritual prayer and the singing of ritual hymns. There was nothing particularly freewheeling about first century Jewish worship from what we can tell, and there's nothing particularly freewheeling about Jewish worship since the first century from what we can very well tell. It is also the place of education, teaching the things of the faith, teaching the Hebrew language, teaching the laws of the Old Covenant, teaching the customs and traditions which have been handed down through the generations, some of which were very recent, as we've discussed in light of the Gospel of Mark. Some are more traditional. Jesus seems to be favoring, counter to popular opinion, if you read it in context of Second Temple Judaism, Jesus seems to be favoring an older, slightly more traditional adherence to Jewish worship as opposed to some of the more recent changes in the observance of the Jewish law. But where these things are debated and where the education in these things is found is in the synagogue. I put the word faith in there with the capital F because I want you to start drawing parallels with how churches are used today. I say the synagogue was the place. Actually, synagogue refers to people. It refers to a gathering of people which occurs in a place. That place, as you'll find out, is usually called the house or the building, oikos in Greek. We'll come back to that concept later, but hold on to the idea now because that's a direct parallel with Christianity. It's a place where community discipline was administered. You could be kicked out of the community at the synagogue. The synagogue was where this occurred, in the group of people who gathered to form that community. This would be like the excommunication that would occur later in Christian communities, though without communion it doesn't mean the same thing, of course, and the Jews don't have Christian communion. What they do have is an ordered and structured membership, and you can lose your identity within the community, and the place where that would occur was within the community, at the synagogue. And of course it's a place of charity and care for the poor, which we also see in the Christian Gospels. All of these functions continued in the Christian churches, the ecclesia, those who are called out. All a Christian church, all the word ecclesia, which is the early word for church, all that means is there's a group of people called out from another group of people. And these people called out are the Christians being called out, arguably, from the Jews. And so they adopt a slight modification of the name of those who gather together for a particular purpose. All of these functions continue, as best we can tell, and we've got some pretty good arguments this direction, almost exactly as they had in the Jewish synagogues. To suggest that Christians kind of started from square one and didn't adopt any or didn't maintain any of their traditions is to me absurd, especially when you can look at what Hippolytus of Rome writes 200 years, almost 200 years after the early Christian movement, and you can still see in Hippolytus's writings, you can still see the elements of Jewish worship right there. So not only did Christians not change in the first century, they didn't change much in the second century either. And the patterns, as I'm going to argue, are there throughout. The order of Sabbath service in the synagogues varied from place to place, but it is clear that the basic model was continued by the Christians with very little modification. To this day, the basic model of synagogue worship is continued in those churches that are labeled liturgical, which possess a regular, traditional order of worship. The Roman Catholics, the Lutherans, Anglicans, Methodists, the Eastern Orthodox, all of these have an order of worship which follows, not just roughly, but in some detail, the basic order that was used in the first century synagogues. There's variation in the synagogues, there's a variation among the Christians, but that variation is the matter of debate, as you see in the Mishnah when you start reading debates over how things should be done. It is not the matter of any significant division at the time. The first half of the service, whether you're Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, Eastern Orthodox, the first half of the service is essentially the order of service from the synagogue, with some modifications through time. History always changes things, but you can see the pattern, and it's clearly there. Now, if you're going to a church that attempts to abolish all this stuff, it's going to be a little bit more puzzling to you. But the pattern of worship was maintained for almost 2,000 years, and as you know, I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. I get a little testy when people say, oh, let's just change it now because we have to worship in the 21st century. Okay, yeah, I don't know why we're so special, but that pattern, you should be aware, is a very old one, and it's not done just to be stodgy. It's done because it gave ritual identity to the communities that observed it and still do. The major difference, the most striking difference at the time, was not so much the order of service in the first century. The most major difference would be the changing of days, the moving of the day of observance from the Sabbath, Saturday, to the day of resurrection, which is Sunday. And this was done in the first century. You'll see in these slides, for those of you who read popular literature such as the writings of Gary Wills, or even worse, the writings of Dan Brown, you'll see that I don't even give them the time of day. Gary Wills is a sharp guy, a really fine scholar from what I can tell of colonial America. He should never have started dabbling in first century history because he just doesn't have the Greek for it. I say that, you know, I'm a Greek snob. I was trained among the Lutherans who really hit the Greek hard, and I find folks who don't know their Greek to be something of an embarrassment. Folks who do know their Greek, and particularly also know their Hebrew, can follow this argument a whole lot better. And so if these things come up, you're reading Gary Will's book, Why Priests, or whatever it's called. I've got that sitting somewhere around here. I finished about half of it, and that was about all I could take. I had better things to read, such as X-Men. Raise those questions, because the Greek words that he refers to don't mean what they think he means. Thank you very much, Inigo Montoya. Coming back to my focus, the main difference is going to be the change of days. The main worship day changes from the Sabbath, the day of rest, to the day of resurrection, and this occurs already in the 1st century. Sorry, Dan Brown, it did not occur as a decree of Constantine. The other changes in dates follow on this. There is a change, as you will see in the Didache, of the days of fasting, from the traditional Monday and Thursday of the Jewish fast to the Wednesday and Friday of the Christian fast, which is maintained in the Eastern Orthodox Church to this day. Beyond that, the changes are gradual and subtle, and in the 1st century, probably not perceptible. So let's consider for a moment just the basic outline of what went on in the average synagogue. You may be hearing my chair creak. It's been going crazy because the room's heating up, and the chair is a very old oak chair, so I apologize for the crackling in the background. The synagogue worship order. Now, I also apologize, and more profoundly apologize, to any Jewish students who may say, that ain't it. Well, it sure isn't quite what you do today. What I've done, and it isn't quite what's done in any particular synagogue anywhere in the 1st century, what I've done is taken what we know of the synagogue worship orders, the various ways things were done in Second Temple Judaism, and I've kind of tried to boil it down. And I've also had help with this from any number of liturgical scholars that I've been comparing to see, what are the baselines of Christian worship. And this is what we've got. So in a very general way, you've got this outline for how synagogue worship is structured when they would go to synagogue on the Sabbath in the 1st century. You begin, as you do today in the synagogue, with the Shema. It's called the Shema. I'm going to pronounce it as I learned it from my Lutheran Hebrew teacher, who in turn learned it from his Jewish Hebrew teacher, and it goes back a long ways that way. So my pronunciations follow my pronunciations as I learned them. Don't get uptight and correct my pronunciations, because I don't care. The Shema. The call to worship. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This is the rallying cry of Jewish worship. This gives, boy, I can't go into this theology, I just don't have time for it, but this gives Jewish identity its teeth. Hear, O Israel, listen up. Shema Yisrael, Adonai, the Lord, Eloheinu, your God, Adonai Echad. The word for Lord there is the Tetragrammaton, which you know I am not in the habit of pronouncing. The Yod-He Vav-He, that is the unique name of God in Israel. So they are called to worship in the name of the one true God. Notice that this goes on to this day, but in a slightly different, very much altered for you Jewish students, form. Not Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, but, for instance, in the Orthodox service, Blessed is the kingdom of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, now and ever and to the ages of ages. Amen. The actual structure of the chant is based on Semitic chant, and there's a kinship between Jewish chant and Christian chant, which I hope to play for you in class sometime, so you can hear what things sound like in both traditions. You may say, well, that's the Orthodox. The Lutherans do a similar thing, and the Catholics do a similar thing. The Lutherans are a little more low-key about it. We begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And there are several variations of this depending on the Lutheran liturgy you're following. Every liturgical tradition has somehow that they begin in the name of God. Those who reject the Trinity, of course, don't use Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Those that aren't Christian, such as the Jews, retain their absolutely accurate traditional call to worship. And yet there are other forms of calls to worship that you see developing. This seems to be an interesting anthropological function in any form of ritual religion. I do think songs from the Appalachians, such as Doc Watson, I Went Down in the Valley to Pray, is actually a form of Appalachian call to worship. Come down and pray. As I went down in the valley to pray, studying about that good old way, and who should wear the robe and crown, good Lord, show me the way. These are the words that tell you it's time to pray. In the more traditional forms of Christianity, they follow the Jewish tradition of calling people to pray in the name that they have received, which is the unique name of God. And that's how the worship begins. After this, the next structure, the next chunk that you can identify as kind of ubiquitous, found everywhere in synagogue worship order, is a series of 18 benedictions and petitions. In Christian churches today, you have the litanies, which are usually 12, and 18 was variable too, from what I can tell from the Mishnah. I'm happy to be corrected on that. But in Christian churches, you have usually 12 prayers. In the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, in peace let us pray to the Lord. Lord have mercy. Kyrie eleison. And other traditions have something like, let us pray to the Lord, and then the people respond, hear our prayer. There's a little different theological evidence on, or emphasis on each of those types of wording. I think the Orthodox have a very different theology behind theirs. But the pattern, that this is what we do next. We have a responsive prayer. We have the worship leaders lead a series of ritual prayers. Very typical and very much done in the early church. I know that bothers some of you. I'm here to bother you. That's one of my jobs as a professor. I need to damage your comfort zone. No, the Christians in the early church did not abolish ritual and ordered prayer. We'll see that in the Didache. When you read the Gospel of Mark correctly, you see that as well. And it certainly is the pattern that is still observed in liturgical churches to this day. After that are the readings from the Torah, and this is one of those places that varies a bit what readings are done when. I'm just going to leave it up as a general structure. The reading of the first 5 books, the books of Moses, the most holy books in Judaism. And then readings from the prophets and histories. So, readings from the prophet Isaiah would occur after the Torah reading, generally speaking. Then would follow a sermon or a discussion of the faith based on the readings, based on the themes of the day that are found in the readings. Between all of these structures, there are going to be more or less some singing or chanting going on. Depending on where you are, it's going to be different chants, different singing. I do want to point out, for you Christian types that go to ritual churches, that one of the hymns that you find in the ancient synagogue, Kadosh, 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 can be translated, and it has been heavily modified, but the same words and the same basic concept is found in Christian churches to this day that observe the traditional liturgies, and that is, Holy, holy, holy Lord God of Sabaoth. Heaven and earth are filled with thy glory. I told a group of Methodists that had gathered to hear me speak one evening years ago, and they were thinking about abolishing these old songs because they didn't mean anything. When they were talking about getting rid of holy, 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 I said, I just want to point out that for those of you who love Jesus, I'm laying it on pretty thick to him, I'll admit. For those of you who love Jesus, you're removing a hymn which is slightly modified over time from a hymn that Jesus would have sung as a boy. Think carefully before taking that out of your service. And how slightly it's modified, I'm willing to debate that. But it's certainly the concept of holy, 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 Lord God of Sabaoth, heaven and earth are filled with thy glory. This is part of the sound, part of the ritual that you find in the ancient synagogue that has been maintained to this day. So there's the sermon. You'll notice in the Gospels, there are a lot of places where it's clear elements of this structure are indicated, but not spelled out clearly. And so there are times when Jesus enters a house, an oikos, and you can tell by what's going on there, especially talking about a specific reading, we'd call that the sermon, would we not, based on this outline, talking about a certain reading, that house is not somebody's private house. That oikos, house, is just a slang word for the local synagogue. Where are you going? We're going to the house of God. We talk about even that to this day in Christian communities. This concept of going to the house in the first century frequently meant the official place of worship. Be that as it may, and I'm happy to point that out and give you a lesson in the diachronic linguistics that Garry Wills so consciously and blatantly ignores in writing his book called Why Priests. Let's continue with things that truly matter, which is talking about the synagogue. What did happen? In other words, not what didn't. Finally, you have the conclusion of it all, Psalms, prayers, and the benediction of Aaron. Think about this for a minute and check out the story of Jesus reading from the prophet Isaiah in Luke chapter 4. Jesus is at the synagogue. There's no question where he is in this account at all. And while at the synagogue, he is handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Note that where that comes in this order. Reading from the prophets and histories. He reads from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and then gives the shortest sermon ever. He said, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Okay, this is the interpretation of the readings. That's a bit scandalous because I have to agree with the Jews who didn't much like Jesus. That's a claim that he is somehow divine. The scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. At least he is the fulfillment of these scriptures referring to the action of God in the world. And that's a bit uppity for anybody. It would be like me walking into a lecture, reading from the primary source material, let's say it's relating to the second coming of Christ, and saying, well, you've been waiting for the second coming of Christ, and that's me. I don't think many of you would put up with that. But just giving a little historical context to something many of you may know. The final words of the synagogue service were generally, I think almost exclusively, and they certainly are still with the synagogue communities to this day, the final words of the synagogue service are from the book of Numbers. It's called the Aaronic blessing, as we talk about it in Christian circles, and I think the Jews talk about it the same way. I'd be happy to learn that from my Jewish students. And the Aaronic blessing is as follows. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. From a slightly modified King James Version, which is still used in Christian services. So there you have it. The parallels are not only evident in the first century, they have lingered to this day. I'm happy to discuss that at greater length when we have class again. Now we come to the house, and this is a tough thing because, as I've already mentioned, the same word that's used for house, oikos in Greek, can also, in a different context, in a different place within language, it can also mean a synagogue. So which is a home, which is a synagogue? As we read the New Testament, a lot of that's debatable, but there was a ritual form of prayer also in the house. The Jewish home was also the place of ritual prayer. In preparation for every Sabbath, you had a special service preparing at the evening meal, preparing for the Sabbath, and particularly for the high feast of Passover. These weekly preparations for the Sabbath are, I would strongly suggest what Jesus is doing when he is going to someone's house to eat. He goes to their house to eat. Well, he's not just having snacks. They don't get out a bunch of Jewish hors d'oeuvres and sit around drinking Jewish wine and talking about Jewish things. No, they do more than that. They engage in Jewish worship, which is done around the family table. And as I'd mentioned before, the family is considerably larger and considerably more ritually organized than we are used to outside of the Jewish community. This was the first century. To go to someone's house to eat is to eat this ritual meal, by and large. I'll allow for exceptions, but I want you to read your New Testament scriptures with that in mind as a strong possibility. It is particularly the Passover meal, the meal that is there for the high feast of the sacrifice in the spring called Passover, Rosh Pesach, that's celebrated in the home, which is the setting for Jesus' Last Supper. Yes and no, I'm going to qualify that in another slide, but hold on to the idea that this is a key element in developing Christian worship. The order of the meal, as we can recognize it from the Gospels, when we read Jesus instituting this Last Supper thing, this Holy Communion, Passover meal, it's arguably a Passover order because it has very strong Passover elements, the number of cups of wine, a certain potential for the halal psalms that we'll see in another slide. There are definite Passover elements here. However, and all the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptics, and John, well, just John, disagree with each other on exact dates, it seems. There are ways to reconcile that, but there's a disagreement on which date the feast is celebrated. Any way you look at it, however, it appears, and I will strongly argue this as well, they celebrated it earlier than it should have been celebrated. Hence, it is very much a new covenant. It isn't celebrated even on the same day as the Old Covenant. And I want to bring something else up which is not shared with you in Lutheran Sunday School. I can speak from experience. In support of the above, I don't know why there is a P there. In support of the above, that should be a comma, leavened bread, artos, was used in Jesus' Last Supper. He did not use unleavened bread, ta'adzima. If it was actually the Passover day and Passover meal that was being celebrated, adzima, true unleavened bread, would be used. The matzos stuff, or I don't think they use little styrofoamy flavored communion wafers that fly around Christianity now. But it's fascinating to realize this. He did not use unleavened bread. He used what would have been eaten before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, artos. Two completely different words, and they have very specific meanings. What does that mean for your practice today? Frankly, I don't care. In the Greek church, we use artos. We used leavened bread. Russian church the same way. When I say Greeks, it just happens to be the parish I'm going to now. But the Orthodox use leavened bread, others use unleavened bread, and frankly, when it comes to the theology of it, it just doesn't matter much. But I do want to point out that this is further support that this was probably not the actual Passover meal, because that bread would not have been present. Adzimo would have been present. The Last Supper was formalized within the earliest years of Christianity to become a public act. We can see it already in the writings of Paul. The Last Supper is a ritual, public act done by the entire community in the oikos, the Christian synagogue, in the ecclesia, the churches. So there you have it. We'll talk about that as you wish, but I hope to have a good discussion. Very gradually, the sacramental or the ritual part, ritual would probably be better, though it becomes, the concept of sacrament is there early on as well. The ritual part of the meal, eating Christ's body and drinking his blood in the special cup of thanksgiving, the Eucharistia cup, this was separated out, and the rest of the meal was moved to a point after the formal service. So you now have the body and blood drunk at one point, and what used to be a massive meal gets moved later. At the time of Paul writing to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, the meal is still blended together. Part of the meal is this sacramental cup, this ritual cup, which is the body and blood of Christ, mystically speaking. The rest of the meal fills people up. That was causing problems. You can see those problems already being caused in the Corinthian community, and so very quickly you move the meal, the big meal, later. This later meal is the feast of fellowship or love, the agape feast, or basically what you do after the formal service to continue the fellowship of the faithful. Where coffee hour, frankly, remains to this day. I find coffee hour kind of a pitiful excuse for a fellowship or agape feast. I prefer, large plates of olives, large plates of feta cheese, large plates of barbecued chicken, maybe a few large pizzas. I think you can fellowship around that a lot easier than Krispy Kremes or half a Krispy Kreme and a weak cup of coffee. And the early church, as we will see, maintained this practice of a day-long feast that would conclude only with the evening prayers. We'll encounter that especially by the 2nd century in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome. So the house worship becomes part of. Pay attention to this because I want to be clear, and it's not clear from this slide, so I'm getting your attention. The house service becomes part of the regular Sunday service of the Christians. Not to say they didn't also have fellowship at homes as well, and that this wasn't probably ritualized. It probably was in the 1st century. But we know that these elements are moved to the Sunday feast. Partly because Christians in the early years, and you get this from the Gospels and as well as outside sources, were frequently break-off groups from their own families. So they aren't necessarily welcome at the traditional family. They form a new family at their church, at their place of gathering, their formal ritual center, their synagogue, if you will. They form a new family that gathers there to perform the house rituals. And these house rituals, of course, then center on the ritual that Jesus himself performed and transformed into the central act of Christian worship, the act of the Eucharist, the cup of blessing that Jesus raises and claims this is his blood, along with the bread he claims is his body. Ask me lots of questions on that. Taken together, the order of the synagogue and some modified order of the Passover service form the entirety of the early Christian liturgy. I don't know why the quotation marks are out of line, but move them around till it makes sense. Christian liturgy should be in quotation marks. I don't know why there's a quotation after that, or maybe it should be liturgy that's in quotation marks. In any case, liturgy comes from the Greek word liturgia, the work of the people. And the word has then come to mean the formal Sunday service in Greek-speaking and even non-Greek-speaking forms of Christianity to this day. If you go to Mass in Moscow, you might want to adjust your language. You're not going to Mass, you're going to liturgy, the liturgy of the Church in the Russian Orthodox Church. So two things get combined into Christian worship sometime in the 1st century. The first is the synagogue order, the service of the word, and the second is a Passover order or the service of the sacrament. And these make the Catholic Mass, the Lutheran Sunday service, and the Orthodox liturgy to this day. I'd like to walk through some of the basic structure of at least a sample Passover meal. They didn't all follow the same structure, but it's clear that some of these elements are included in whatever Jesus was doing in his Last Supper. So he was either instituting some type of new Passover meal or following the order of an old Passover structure that got handed down, because the elements are very clearly visible, even though the meal itself was probably not what would pass for a Seder today. I'm getting this pretty much from the Mishnah Pesachim, tractate. That H there is usually CH in modern transliterations of Hebrew, but it's got the little dot under it in the Hebrew that I usually use. Pesachim, Rosh Pesach, the Feast of Passover. So this is the Mishnah tractate that deals with the Feast of Passover. I read it myself, found it confusing, went to a bunch of other sources to help me sort this out, including some good Jewish sources. So what you got here is, again, a down and dirty overview of what the Passover meal would have looked like, I think, first century-ish. That should be enough qualification to keep me safe. The most common element that you see, and one that begins the meal, is the Berkah. There it is in Hebrew, so if you're ever on a graphic form of Jeopardy, you can memorize these things and say, yes, that's the Berkah, Alex. Barak is actually what it says there. Same root. Any way you look at it, every word in Hebrew has a three-letter root. What is the Berkah? It is the blessing. Blessed. Varuk. Blessed. So you begin with the blessing. Prayer for the blessing of the day. A Berkah prayer always consisted of the following formula, more or less. The invocation, which begins, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, Melech ha'olam, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe. That's one form anyway. And then you'd have a thanks, a petition, and a closing. Some of you Christian types still observe this kind of pattern for prayer as a way of structuring your own private prayers. Well, it goes back to the house worship of ancient Judaism. I'm using this as a model. This is the Passover model, but the weekly prayers right before Sabbath would have had a structure as well, which includes some of these elements. How many? I don't know. That's a matter of debate all over the place. Then you have another Berkah, another blessing. And this is the blessing, the first blesses the entire feast. This is the blessing of the first cup. Today, you got that eating of symbolic foods, green herbs, bitter herbs, fruit puree that goes along with the modern Seder. This quite possibly is not done in first century Palestine. I'm putting that in there just so if you do Seders, as you Christian types, if you do Seders thinking this is what Jesus did, I soften the blow a little bit. Let me change that to give my personal opinion. There's no way any of this was done in first century Palestine at the time of Jesus. And if you prefer to call it first century Judea, I would appreciate it very much. But I inherited certain patterns of speech with this topic. Then you have another Berkah, the blessing of the second cup. Now, what are the cups? They are large tumblers of wine that could be mixed with water to varying degrees of alcoholic power, but you usually started with something around 18% and moved down. They are large cups of wine. You are already at the second large cup of wine. The cup of wine that they would have with these Berkah blessings at the time, I know because we dig them up, would better hold a beer than what we would consider a glass of wine today. Some of them look like pint glasses, so you could get a pretty good buzz, I'd think, by the end of the second cup if you didn't otherwise do this on a regular basis. Then you've got the Haggadah. Haggad is the root there, then for those of you looking it up. The telling of the story. This is the telling of the Passover story and the Passover meal, but it's also arguably the telling of the Christian story when this pattern of worship gets converted into the service of the sacrament, the second half of the Sunday morning service among Christians. There are elements that tell the story of Jesus consecrating the bread and wine, and that would fit there quite nicely. And then there is another thing, the Midrash, which explains the feast. Why is this night different from all other nights? And what is the feast? A Midrash is an explanation, lot of meaning behind that word. And then you have the singing of the Hallel, the first Hallel Psalms. Yes, we get that we praise. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. We praise God. Psalms 113 and 14 would have been used here. And then you have the drinking of the second cup. Man, you bless the second cup, now you get to down it. The Haggadah cup is called in the Passover meal. Then you have the Brakah, the blessing of the bread, and the eating of the meal, including unleavened bread and lamb. There is no mention of anything at the Last Supper relating to lamb or any of the other bits associated with these special foods. There's certainly no unleavened bread. It's artos, as we've talked about before. But the brakah is the blessing of the meal itself. So you got a couple of cups of wine before the meal. Maybe you're drinking a little during the meal as well. And then you have the blessing of the third cup, which is called colloquially the cup of blessing. Is this the institution of communion? Is this the cup that Jesus takes aside and says, "This is my blood"? There's an argument that way, and that argument partly comes from reading the Apostle Paul, who refers to the cup of blessing which we bless. Is it not the blood of Christ? In referring to the Eucharist. So he uses the phrase cup of blessing, and it might refer to exactly this third cup. So by the time communion rolls around in the Last Supper, the disciples have already downed 2 fairly large cups of wine, and this is the third, which is passed around. The other possibility, and I actually lean this way myself, is that that is not the cup that Jesus used, that he instituted a special blessing, a special cup, with possibly a fourth cup, or maybe the structure of the meal isn't this formal anyway, and there's one central cup of blessing. If they were generally drinking these cups of wine, it does explain why the Gospels tell us, first of all, that the disciple John kind of fell asleep and leaned over on Jesus, kind of fell asleep on Jesus' chest. It also explains, and you've got some pictures of the Eucharist where he's doing exactly that, later icons showing John kind of passed out. Well, he's the youngest among the apostles traditionally, and probably couldn't hold his third or fourth massive cup of wine quite as well as they could. It also explains why we're told that as Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, his disciples fall asleep. He's about to face his own death. He's in a very sobering situation. But they've gone out singing psalms. We know that they ended the evening with the singing of the psalms. It tells us that. And the final halal cup, you've got one more cup. So they may have had just enough that it was fairly easy to fall asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, at least until the soldiers came. But this basic pattern, the blessing, we have in the anaphora in the Christian service, where the elements are blessed, the discussion, the telling of the story, what happened the night in which he was betrayed, the midrash, which has been replaced, I would argue, with the Eucharistic prayers, where those are still used, and then the blessing of bread and wine and the distribution. And of course the singing of psalms goes along with that. So it's not identical, but I want to give you a feel for some of the elements which I think were clearly present when Jesus decided to make a special meal, and which are clearly present in Christian worship based on its heritage from Judaism. I want to spend a couple of slides on the central rituals of Christian identity, the rituals that gave Christians their identity, both an initial identity, the rite of initiation or baptism, and their weekly identity, the Eucharist, to go a little bit deeper into these two focuses of Christian being in the first century. So baptism, what baptism is, as some of you have asked, and we looked at in the Gospel of Mark, baptism was a complete immersion in water, usually running water. We'll see that in the Didache. And it was also a rite of initiation, a rite that brought people into a particular community among Jewish communities in the first century. So that the Jewish community, which eventually becomes known as Christian or Christianity, uses this rite is no shock. That John is wandering around in the deserts by the River Jordan, calling out, "Repent, be baptized." This is no shock. He's calling for a recommitment or a renewal. What's different is that in Christianity it takes on a much higher significance and becomes an event that is only done once by anybody, until much later when you have this phenomenon of rebaptism, but that's outside the time frame of this course. It's done once, and it unites you to the Christian community in a much stronger way than any Jewish rhetoric ever had used before that. And the person responsible for that rhetoric is the Apostle Paul, or if you believe he was getting some coaching, well, let's just say the Apostle Paul and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hallelujah. Ritual washings were also common as we looked at the mystery cults in the Roman world. They were common to many religious movements in the Greco-Roman world. We saw it as part of the ritual of Atargatis of Hierapolis, the Syrian goddess, though it wasn't the part of the ritual that was gross, it was just kind of a common part. But Christians attached a very significant meaning to the concept of baptism, which is found nowhere else other than the Christian scriptures. Through baptism, one becomes mystically attached to Jesus Christ, united to his death, and without losing personal identity, Jesus Christ then lives in that person. In the book of Romans, Paul describes the process of baptism as a dying, joining Christ in death, and then rising into a new life. In Galatians, it's described as putting on the identity of Christ without losing your own. You put on his righteousness, you put on his divinity, in a more Eastern understanding of that verse, so that Christ then lives in you and is constantly with you. The martyrs take this very seriously, as we will see when we read the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas. For adults, baptism occurred only after a period of instruction, called catechesis, which rapidly increased in length to a period of 3 years. So, let's say you would like to become a Christian. In the early church, some people were baptized right out because they were faithful Jews and they were just choosing the branch of Judaism that they preferred. As you brought people in who knew less about the old faith, who knew less about the rituals and prophecies and traditions that had been inherited from Judaism, it took longer to teach. And eventually, and it is rapid, it's within 100 years, you have a pretty standard expectation that if somebody's interested in becoming a Christian, they're going to spend 3 years learning about it first. You have to allow some regional variation there, but this does develop. Some places it's a great deal shorter. Nowhere is it really longer, but this kind of expectation of 3 years. You will go through a period of training equivalent to that period which Jesus spent in his earthly ministry before you are allowed to be baptized and become a Christian. This is for adults, and it was dependent upon faith, but remember, faith isn't believing, it's an attitude of receiving. That's pisteuo in the Greek. The way we use the word belief now as a mental activity is certainly not what Christ meant, as we've discussed already. All evidence does point to the fact that it wasn't just adults that were baptized. I'm sorry if your tradition does this, but there's plenty of evidence to say that the early Christians, from the very beginning, included children in baptism. We will see this in the Didache when we read it together. There is no evidence for certain that there was any kind of an age of accountability where you're smart enough or enough of a believer or mentally prepared to make your commitment to Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, so that age of accountability doctrine doesn't seem to have any analog in the early church. Sorry, Southern Baptists that I've spoken with. There is a sense, however, in one set of early Christian documents, and we'll learn about these people more, and it may not make you happy, but they're the Montanists. They were considered a mild form of heretic in North Africa particularly, but also elsewhere. And they did practice only adult baptism, so there is a group in the early church that practices only adult baptism, but they're kind of a fringe group, an important fringe group, a much respected fringe group, but the groups that weren't Montanists really thought the Montanists were in error on these things. We can tell that infant baptism was certainly common by the time of the Montanist movement in the 2nd century and the 3rd century because they constantly complain, not constantly, but enough that we can tell, they complain about infant baptism enough that we can tell it was happening. They're not going to get up and complain about something that wasn't happening. So the Montanists' objection to the fact that people were baptizing infants in a widespread manner is evidence that they were baptizing infants in a widespread manner. So just from history, that's how I make my argument. Baptism did mean dedication to Christianity to the exclusion of all other religious or spiritual attachments. You could not be baptized and then join another spiritual cult the way people would kind of shift from mystery religion to mystery religion or stack up a few. I'm a member of the cult of Mithras and a member of the cult of Isis and Osiris. Once baptized in the Christian movement, you had forsaken all other possible spiritual attachments, including Judaism. It is a transition point for people who are Jews to join the Christian form of Judaism, or the form that believes that Jesus was Messiah. Once that's done, your commitment is complete. There will be no going back. If you do go back, you've made your choices. It's a very serious day. Since it means an absolute dedication to the Christian faith, what we do see is a move toward baptizing adults rather than children, which occurs later at the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 4th centuries. Why end of 3rd and beginning of the 4th? It happens a little bit earlier than that too, but then especially because the persecutions are so fierce that to baptize a child would be a death sentence. To bind them to the Christian community would be binding them to being a target of the fiercest persecutions in Christian history to that point. So it became more common to wait until adulthood to baptize. Hold on to that thought. It explains some things that go on in the 4th century with some big-name characters that we'll get to know, including Constantine, the emperor. I'm not keen on calling him the Great. He was a great general. I think he kind of muffed it in certain ways as an emperor. Constantine gets baptized on his deathbed very late, and even some of the most pious kids from the most pious families, Basil becomes Saint Basil, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, these folks are getting baptized as adults as well, and we'll look at why that is well into the 4th century, but it does begin with this concept of not dooming your child to the stigma of being Christian in a time of persecution. Now some points on the Eucharist, this adaptation of the Passover meal, which we've discussed at least in an introductory way a bit earlier. Here are some things that were true about it in the 1st century. It was observed at least once a week, sometimes daily in different communities, but it was guaranteed to be observed every Sunday morning in remembrance of the resurrection of Christ. This was the feast that is the New Covenant, and the New Covenant is sealed by the resurrection of Christ on Easter morning. So every Sunday morning is a small Easter when the Eucharist is observed, and it could be observed at other times as well. Only those who were baptized could receive the cup of blessing, or the bread and wine that is the body and blood of Christ, and all who were baptized would partake. There would not be in the early church folks holding back from taking communion. If you were Christian, you received communion, the mystical body and blood of Christ. This included children. It wasn't until about the 8th century, for reasons I'll explain much later in this course, it wasn't until about the 8th century that the habit of waiting to give children what we call communion now, the Eucharist, the habit of waiting till they were, 8, 10, 12, 16, that developed, and it only developed in the Western Church. So the Eastern forms of Christianity never developed a confirmation age or a first communion age. Children would be right there receiving communion as well. The fact that children received communion in some texts is also evidence that the children were baptized. There's another one of those points in the argument I was making on the previous slide. If you were not baptized, if you were just curious, or if you had already been admitted to the formal order, the group of people known as the catechumens, you would be asked to leave. No, you would be forced to leave before the second half of the service begins. You'd go through the service of the Word, you'd go through the service where the prayers and benedictions culminate with the sermon and some psalms, and then you would be kicked out. In the Eastern churches, in our services, to this day, although we don't kicking anybody out, and everyone's welcome to come watch but not receive the Eucharist, only Eastern Christians receive the Eucharist. In Eastern churches, we still have the words to this day, chanted by the deacon, usually a large burly fellow capable of wrestling people out of church if necessary. The doors, in wisdom let us attend. The doors. Bar the doors. Let all catechumens depart, let no catechumens remain. The doors, in wisdom let us attend. And this is the point of the service in which anyone who wasn't a full, recognized Christian would leave. There is also a function of that in the time of persecutions, in that if you weren't a full recognized Christian, you wouldn't be partaking of the ritual that weekly marked who was a Christian and who was not. You could make the case, at least, that you were only inquirer. Although catechumens felt, and they were very much in keeping with non-catechumen attitudes, once you've committed to being a catechumen, why would you turn your back on the religion that you are about to embrace? And we will see this when we study the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas after the first test. This occurred as the high point. This is the most important part of Sunday worship, and it was its conclusion. It was the conclusion of a liturgical ceremony with all of its readings and psalms, which could last for several hours, and sometimes still does to this day in various corners of the Eastern Orthodox world, where the hustle and bustle of having to do something on a Sunday just doesn't exist. I was at a Greek cathedral for the Feast of Holy Theophany. You know, it's packed with people, beautiful cathedral, and a lot of folks who were showing up to that church service who hadn't been to church in a while, a lot of young people, and one old monk standing right out in front, just as one of the worshipers. You know, the priests and deacons are back, and the bishop is back working the rituals of the service, and the singing's going on. This monk was hilarious to watch, because he was about 90 years old, and he was used to these long services. So, and the Eastern Church always stands through the entire service. There's no pews in a traditional church. His eyes would keep darting over to the young people, because you could see he's a little concerned that something might happen. At about hour 3, the younger people, the teenagers and 20-somethings, started passing out on a fairly regular basis. This was just too much church, way longer than what they were used to at their local parishes, but it was what he was used to at the monastery. So this 90-year-old guy is just glancing over, and pretty soon, yep, you can see what he was waiting for. The kids start dropping in dead faints, one after the next. It was pretty funny. That's a complete tangent, but it gives you a sense of the type of commitment you've got if you're an early Christian, where these hours-long services were the rule rather than the exception. You had to work yourself up to that. It was kind of like an athletic event of standing and singing the whole time. So the high point of the entire liturgy, all the hours that you're there worshiping and singing and hearing the scriptures, the high point is the reception of the wine and bread, the body and blood of Christ. Originally, as we'd said above, it was part of a complete meal based upon the Passover order of worship. Then very early on you have a separation into two different meals, one which is ritual, the other which you can feed yourself pretty good on. One thing your book gets right, and I'm going to have to spend some time in class explaining what parts are right and what parts are wrong, but this one's right. This was not merely a symbolic eating of Christ's body and blood, the way we use symbol today. It wasn't a casual or a meaningful act of remembrance. It was far more than that. The Greek word means kind of remembrance, anamnesis, and I'm going to go through this in class to explain it in much greater detail and to answer your questions. But an anamnesis is an act through which the faithful were mystically joined with Christ's actual passion and resurrection. They took the words, "This is my body," very seriously. It was not symbolic among early Christian communities. It meant you were joining in this act of memory. You were time traveling in your spirit. You were time traveling in your personal existence. And what you received was the actual body of Christ crucified on the cross. Ooh, thankfully it's bread. And the actual blood of Christ given and shed on the cross. And it was the living sacrifice. It wasn't a dead thing. You're not a zombie eating dead people. This was a living sacrifice. You receive into your body the living body and the living blood of Jesus Christ. In this act, you become, literally become, one of the disciples in the upper room where the Eucharist occurs. You become one of the people at the foot of the cross. You become one of the people at the open tomb of the resurrection. And you become, transcending space and time, one of the people in the court of heaven where Christ is found. That's interesting stuff. I'm going to leave it at that little poetic introduction and then make a couple other points. The fact that everyone in the early church believed that this was Christ's body and this was Christ's blood, the bread was Christ's body and the wine was Christ's blood, didn't believe that they had some late medieval understanding of a chemical change or an actual transubstantiation from one substance to the next. This was spiritual, but real. It was more real than a physical transformation, you could argue, because the spiritual things are always more real. It does fit when you listen to the way they talk about it, and this probably informed Martin Luther and company. It does fit with the way Lutherans talk about this concept of the real presence. Christ is really and truly present. The living Christ is really and truly present in, with, and under the body, and the bread and wine of communion. It's still bread and wine, but it is absolutely and completely in, with, and under it is the body and blood of Christ. This is standard 8th grade catechism stuff. That's pretty close to the way you hear it talked about in the early church, and it may be the recovery of some of these early documents spurred that language among the Lutherans. But to be fair, among those who think that in the Roman Church, who thought at the time of Luther that certain good doctrines had gone too far, you could say they held pretty much the same thing also. This idea of chemical change was a bit too radical for a lot of folks. But the other is a very early church concept. I'd like to talk a little bit about how discipline and control or order was maintained in the early church, and this too goes back to Judaism. There's a habit of thinking, and Gary Wills, oddly as a Catholic, has adopted this. Why am I talking about Gary Wills so much? Some of you know every year I adopt a book that I know I'm going to disagree with, and I force myself in the spring while I'm teaching this course to read that book as a way of keeping myself sharp in how I'm thinking and what type of arguments I'm using in a topic, history of Christianity, which is considerably more contentious and raises considerably more debates than, say, the history of the Celts. But one of the things that comes up frequently in discussion with folks is an idea which is untenable historically, that the early church had no real order or structure when it came to the hierarchies of the local communities. If it's a Jewish community, then there was structure and hierarchy, and Christianity was a Jewish community. Even as the church owed its liturgical structure, the way it ordered its worship, to Judaism, it also owed its government and organization to Jewish models. And I would say I would make that statement much stronger now that I've done a little more reading than I had when I wrote this slide. And this is in spite of what our textbook says. Your textbook is just dead wrong that the early Christian church did not have some form of formal governance. It clearly did, out of which grew the modern sense of hierarchy in the church, which exists to this day in various churches everywhere. Your textbook's just dead wrong, so use a black Sharpie instead of a highlighter and take that out if you want a more accurate textbook. Both the temple and the synagogue were governed by a hierarchy of trained, if not professional. It may not have been the only thing they did, or they may have been volunteers. They were trained religious leaders. The temple had ranks of priests. The synagogue had two main orders. And when I say this, I'm giving you the more commonly accepted version of this, as it's presented in History of Christianity classes everywhere. I've come to change my mind on it, and I'll explain that in a subsequent slide. But the two main orders that no one's going to debate existed in the synagogue are, first of all, the archisynagogos in the Greek, the ruler of the synagogue or the head of the assembly. In Hebrew, that's Rosh HaKnesset. Now, as you're reading through the Gospels, you come across this story of Jairus, a archisynagogos, a ruler of the synagogue, who has a daughter that's sick, and Jesus comes and heals her. He's in this position, and he asks Jesus to come and heal his daughter. So when you think about it, I mean, folks who read their Bibles today don't know who this guy was, just that he was some kind of important dude. Well, he was actually the head, or the guy in charge of the local synagogue. What did he do? His duties included presiding over services, maintaining order, being the one who made the decisions, and designating the roles within the service. He would be the one who would choose who would do the readings and who would do the chanting and how the service would go. He's in charge, he makes the decisions, that ensures that things are done without chaos. He is also given the charge of regulating the teaching and observance of tradition. Ask me about the word tradition when you get the chance. It's not what you think it is. There's a lot more to it. In other words, this is the person who oversees and ensures that things are done right according to the rules of the community. The Greek term could also be applied honorarily to a benefactor of a synagogue. In other words, you could have the archisynagogos who does the work of maintaining the synagogue and making sure that things go smoothly and that things are taught correctly, not falsely. But it could also refer in an honorary way more to somebody who simply supported, who paid for the synagogue. So it also had an honorific title. And the second order of authority within the synagogue structure was the hyperetes, or the Hebrew chazan, who is the servant of the synagogue. This was generally a paid employee who was given the task of caring for the scrolls, teaching, enforcing discipline, caring for the building and furnishings. And these two orders, the archisynagogos, the one who was ultimately in charge, and the hyperetes, kind of the doer of the day-to-day work, not just, janitorial functions as we might think of it, but also day-to-day teaching. He was the servant of the synagogue, maintaining the scrolls, ensuring that everything was ready for the community. This was the job, the very practical work of the chazan, the hyperetes. What you see next to this basic slide, what you see in the corner is a little black and white picture of a synagogue. You can see the niche, the arched niche where the Torah scroll would rest. Note, there's a lot of pictures. This is not what you think of in a synagogue today. Counter to common assumptions, synagogues of classical antiquity often did have a lot of art and images, and this one's absolutely filled with pictures. The concept among these communities, it seems, is that the second commandment against graven images was referring to idols rather than pictures that could be generally good in your synagogue worship. Some Christian churches, and I would say the majority, that would be my argument, the majority followed suit with these who used art, but there was also a split in both the ancient Jewish and the ancient Christian communities over those who favored depictions of images in the church and synagogue and those who opposed it. So you see both trends in the ancient traditions of the two religions. In Judaism, the habit of not having art in synagogue or having only stylized art but avoiding the what could be even remotely confused with the worship of an idol, this took over. In Christian churches, until the Reformation, folks, the default position, with one exception, which is part of this course, the iconoclast controversy, the default position became, of course, it's important to have art in churches. So that was widely embraced, almost universally embraced, among Christian communities by the time of the legalization of Christianity. That it wasn't by certain people, such as Eusebius of Caesarea, is evidence of how widely it's being embraced, because just like the Montanists complaining about infant baptism, Eusebius is lamenting that so many Christian churches have adopted the use of images, and some in particular. Another slide relating to exactly the same thing with a little bit more detail. Now, if you have two main orders in the synagogue, how do you adapt or adopt and modify this into what become the Christian clerical or the Christian clergy orders? However it came about, by the last quarter of the 1st century, the Christian communities had at least a twofold structure of governance. The top, the overseer, the episkopos, the word means overseer. Originally, it seems, at least to some, and I disagree with this point now, originally that was the same basic office as another title, the elder, presbyteros. This person was on top of the local community and presided over the service of the local community and regulated teaching, the tradition of the apostles, as it was called, and discipline. What was handed down from the apostles and discipline was maintained by the episkopos, the overseer. Below the episkopos was diakonos, which literally means servant. Wow, sounds a bit like the chazan, or the hyperites. The diakonos is given the tasks of maintaining the distribution of charity, discipline in the community, teaching, and other responsibilities relating to the daily business of the early church. In spite of all the flutter and fluff about how early Christian churches didn't have a clear governing structure or order, or clergy if you want to call it that, it is really difficult not to recognize the similarity in roles between these two offices, which are clearly mentioned as being in the early church from the beginning, and the archisynagogos and hyperites in the synagogue. Why are these orders in the early churches from the beginning? Because they came and are direct translations of the Jewish orders of archisynagogos, ruler of the synagogue, who oversees everything. Episkopos means overseer, and hyperites, the servant who does the day-to-day work, and the diakonos, which means the servant who does day-to-day work. By the beginning of the 2nd century, as the standard story goes, in various places, a third class of clergy had developed, the presbyter, which is seemingly a break-off. You have episkopos, which seems to be the same thing as presbyter, as some people read it, and then the presbyter breaks off into a lower form of authority underneath the episkopos. The word episkopos is still the official word for bishop in Eastern Christianity, and it's interesting that when Lutherans decided they didn't like the term bishop, they kept the office and changed it to superintendent or overseer, the one who looks over the church. So it's interesting, these linguistic connections. But if you have bishops or episcopi, the episkopos, as being the head overseer, then underneath the episkopos become the lower division, the presbyteri, the presbyters, which they're still called in the Eastern Church, and beneath them is the third order of clergy, the deacons. Then you can see how this begins. You can see where this order begins, and it begins right away in the 1st century. It begins before, there's no period of time, sorry Gary Wills, if Christianity is a Jewish structure where there isn't some form of this exact order. The words aren't settled yet. The formal titles take a while to develop, but the order itself is there. Now, I've recently been converted in my thinking by reading, recently by I mean last 4 years ago, I guess, reading James Tunstead Birchall's book, From Synagogue to Church. I've been convinced that he's right. I've played around with it, I've gone through some of the source material myself, and I think he's right. As a historian, I'd always kind of held that the threefold clergy, bishop, priest, and deacon, or episkopos, presbyteros, diakonos, this developed. It didn't exist in the early church. Birchall argues that it existed in the synagogue, and therefore it existed in the early church. And after going through it all, and you can ask me about this, more details, if this is the type of thing that turns your crank, I have a feeling it isn't for most of you, but it would mean that the three orders of clergy are original. Now, Birchall goes at this from a point of view where he expected not to come to that conclusion. But by examining the evidence, he came to that conclusion, and his book is a fascinating kind of foray into how the historical mind works. Nifty stuff, that. In the early church, there are also numerous other offices or orders to be found other than the big three. It appears in certain communities that everyone was given an order or a specific place within the community. We'll see some of this suggested, I think, as we talk about the Didache, but the idea of everybody having a place the moment they enter the church, ranks and order within the local community, no matter how small those communities were, this develops and is firmly in place by the time of the end of the 2nd century in Hippolytus of Rome. We'll talk about that as well. I'm in one of those orders. In the Orthodox Church, I'm a reader, which is the order that reads publicly in church. By at least the beginning of the 2nd century, there was a sense in which the episkopos or the presbyter were seen as holding an office analogous to the temple priest. Note, that's the beginning of the 2nd century. That's by 100, by the time of Ignatius of Antioch writing to the Magnesians, which is one of your assignments to give me a report on. By that time, there is some form of authority and role which is clearly analogous between the Christian episkopos and the temple priests that had now passed away along with the temple. The sacrifices that were presided over by temple priests were now the single sacrifice of Christ once for all that was presided over, the Eucharist, by the episkopos. We do have evidence that in certain locations the women were routinely ordained as deacons with a specific charge of ministry to women. We do not, and I'm taking a position in debates here too, we do not have, in my opinion, convincing evidence that women were ever priests or deacons. In fact, the evidence is pretty thin, or priests or bishops, I'm sorry. The evidence is pretty thin for that. But did they have a specific hierarchical authority within the church? At one point, yeah, they would have held the same rank as their male counterparts who were deacons. Another thing you're welcome to ask me about, because there's a lot of history involved here and a lot of debate, and I'm just weighing in with where I am as a historian. Otherwise, there's really no evidence for the female clergy until the Montanist movement. Now, the Montanists do have female clergy, female presbyters, what we now have for no good reason called a priest, and female overseers or bishops. So if you're looking for female clergy, the Montanist movement has it. The downside there, once again, is the Montanists are rejected by other Christians as not being mainline and effectively being kind of a lovable but serious low-level heretic, as opposed to the high-level heretics which we'll encounter among the Gnostics. The Montanists are wrong and need to be brought back to the truth, and these things are part of the Montanist movement. Before you start standing up and cheering the Montanist movement, ladies, you may want to know a little bit more about it. It was an extremely strict group of folks who you may think that they were freer because they allowed more freedom for women to move into the ranks of the church. But careful with your freedom, they also encourage things like lifelong celibacy for everybody, which may temper your enthusiasm. One more major topic, and then some pictures thank heaven, some pictures to round out this fairly long discussion with. Some archaeological finds have shed light on where the early Christians worshipped, not just how they worshipped, and it patterns once again off of how Jews worshipped. What is the house church? Let's talk about this for a minute. For many years, scholars have recognized that early Christians, like the Jews, worshipped in houses which weren't just somebody's home. They were specifically set aside and sanctified for Christian worship. We'll see this in the Didache again. You're looking for primary source evidence, I'll get it to you. The New Testament also needs to be read with this in mind, and there's plenty of evidence for what's going on here, as I mentioned in the Gospel of Mark discussion we had. These places are renovated. Look at the diagram on the right. A typical row house in any Roman city anywhere would look something like this row house at the top before renovation. These row houses are part of an excavation in a Syrian border town of the Roman Empire called Dura Europos. And this was 3rd century stuff, 200s. But notice how they knock out the walls on the left side of the building. See, the top is the building before renovation. The bottom is the building where they've knocked out the walls and formed one large worship area. Now that worship area is set aside for worship. There is a table at one end, the bottom end, that has become the altar as we talk about it now. But this is what's going on with the changing of a normal house into a space of worship. There's a lot of theories about whose houses were targeted and how this worked. Some people might donate their houses. It's a possibility that if somebody was, in financial trouble, they could, and part of the Christian community, they could say, okay, convert my house to a church. They'd make the modifications, and the person would live there pretty well rent-free. These theories are going around. I'm not sure we can say a whole lot other than what the archaeology and the texts tell us, which is that people didn't worship in homes. They worshipped in specially modified buildings which were designed for Jewish and Christian worship. Were there also freestanding synagogues and freestanding churches? Yes, there actually were. But this was a much more economical way to pull it off, and that's what I think was going on with how the structure of worship was set aside. In this case, the actual architecture of worship was set aside. And so we call this the house church. You hear house churches referred to among archaeologists. That's what we're talking about. A specially modified building. Now, to be fair, it's only called the house church because this title comes from a Christian sites. It's the house synagogue elsewhere, and I'll show you again the Dura Europos synagogue, which I had a black and white picture of before. So keep this in mind. This is how they would repurpose their houses into houses of God, into actual worship space. Once it's made into worship space, it can only be used for worship space. I'll show you where in the Didache I get that, but it also is a standard expectation of Jewish synagogues that are constructed this way, and it's clear from the architecture that these rooms were not used for anything but the rituals of Christian worship. Room 5 up top, if you've got a clear view of the diagram, otherwise look on your PDF notes. Room 5 in the Christian setting would have been an area for teaching, so let's just think about what happens when the deacon announces that all of the initiates, all the catechumens have to depart. They have to go someplace. They're not going to be there for the Eucharist. Where do they go? They go to room 5 to be taught about the faith before they commit to it through baptism. Room 6 at top, and this is straight out of a Dura Europos house church, room 6 has been converted into a designated baptistry. There's some areas that could still be used for living, but these three massive or largest rooms of the entire structure would have been used from left to right as the main worship area for the Eucharist, room 5 in the middle, the area for teaching, and room 6 on the far right was the area which was completely set aside for baptisms in running water. Nifty, that. Acts 2:46 then, this is just one example in the New Testament where thinking about, sorry, Gary Wills again, where thinking about Christians worshiping in each other's living rooms is just bunk. 2:46, they broke bread from house to house, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching uh, and prayer, breaking of bread and prayer. These are in the synagogues that they do this. You wouldn't dream of that type of activity if you were a first century Jew just occurring in your back room. They also didn't have living rooms at the time. That's kind of a Renaissance development that begins with the concept of a study and a withdrawing room. They didn't have that type of private space. They didn't have shag carpet or coffee tables or recliners or any of the other things that go along with our image of people hanging out in a casual space. What they had was converted formal spaces, and that's what that particular piece of the Christian scriptures is referring to. There's a lot of talk about catacombs being used as places of Christian worship. That's kind of a myth that grew up in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. From what I can tell, there is no good evidence that catacombs were regularly used for Sunday worship. They were used for prayer and worship, which creeped out the Romans. It is possible that in times of intense persecution they became places of Sunday morning worship, sort of bunkers for the faithful, but they were pretty easy to find them there, so I don't know about that theory either. But we just don't have, from catacomb archaeology, evidence that this was regularly used, like on a Sunday basis, for meeting and observing the Eucharist. There were, as I mentioned, some freestanding structures also, like freestanding synagogues. There were some freestanding churches. These tended to diminish in number, not surprisingly, during the intense periods of persecution, because they were too easy to target. It's a whole lot harder to target something that looks like the house right next to it. Archaeological finds dating to the 3rd century at Dura Europos, this is what I've got on a diagram here, on the eastern frontier of the empire, have given us a clue as to what the typical arrangement may have been throughout the first 3 centuries. Or maybe not. The truth is, archaeological evidence is pretty sparse. The amazing thing about Dura Europos is that we found both an intact synagogue, I'm meaning as scholars generally, I wasn't there. We found both an intact synagogue and a mostly intact modified church building. That means the walls are at least partially standing and we can see what's going on. Most of the things we excavate have nothing remaining of the walls, so it's hard to tell what we're looking at. So I'm going to go back to some pictures now and talk over just, what is Dura Europos and what kind of insight do we get from this. The first picture I want to go to is a color version of that nifty black and white art-filled synagogue that we have. There it is. Wow, this is so cool. This is the space of Jewish worship. Now you can see by the dimensions of the room that in this case the room is turned sideways from the church. The church is going up and down the long way. This is kind of arranged the wide way. You have a ridge along the walls. You don't have any chairs. There wouldn't have been any chairs in the original. You have a ridge along the walls where people, if they need to, can sit. And that artwork is just phenomenal. I know. I'm at heart. There's a part of me that's really wants to retire from being a historian and become an art historian in my next life. That or drive a front loader, which has its own joys. This is the only easily downloadable picture of the Christian structure. This is the baptistry that I showed you on the earlier slide. That room which is set aside for baptizing people. And so you can see the tub. There's a big tub which is used for baptizing people. Note also the art on the walls. There's this kind of neat ceiling motif which is reconstructed. But fascinating stuff, and I'll have these ready for us to look at them in class again so you can ask me questions about what's going on. But this is a space of Christian worship like the previous is a space of Jewish worship. Now, Dura Europos is one thing, but you also have, and this is about a century later, so this is kind of late stuff, but I think it's neat because I see it every time I go to Britain when I go to the British Museum. You also have a 4th century British church which is based on this house church model, a hollowed out section of a Roman villa which has been turned into designated worship space. At one end, you have the artwork which would be over the altar, as I understand it. This is the Chi-Rho, the symbol of Christ, and you also have the Alpha and the Omega. Who is the Christ? The Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He transcends time, in other words. There's this unique... Now, the artwork itself is fairly typical for the walls of a Roman villa. What's unique is that it's been converted into a type of Christian symbolism which includes the imagery of baptism at the bottom, and I would argue, having looked at this quite a bit, that there's a certain imagery of the Eucharist engaged here as well, woven into that, woven into the patterns of things in that wreath area. But I might be pushing it a bit. I'm seeing what I want to see. But the baptism motif is definitely there, is it not? That would be the front of the church then, behind the altar. On the side of the church, and somewhat similar to Dura Europos thousands of miles away, is artwork which includes people. There it is. There's the side of the church. There are a group of priests at the top. They're priests for reasons I will explain shortly, but their garb is the symbolic garb that's associated actually with priests of the Eastern Church to this day. It's found in Britain. This whole site is from 4th century Roman Britain, the 300s. I just find it fascinating that Christianity, thousands of miles away, has pretty much the same pattern or structure. Different artwork to some degree, but only to some degree. But that's what Rome does. It united these trade routes. Now let's take a slightly closer look at one of the figures. I'm going to go to the figure on the far left. I just want to point out a few things that we can explore further in class. And then, you know what, let's call it an evening, because this has been a long lecture for me, and I know it's a long lecture for you. One more picture. There he is, the guy on the far left. That weird cross arrangement is still typical of Eastern Orthodox clergy to this day, as are the colored garments, not just white, as is typical in the Western Church. But here we are in Britain, and there is a very Greek or very Eastern garb being worn by this fellow who is otherwise probably very British by hair and facial structure, lack of beard, that type of thing. His hands are raised in prayer. People did not pray with their hands folded in the early church. They prayed with their hands raised to receive the blessings of God and to appropriately acknowledge where those blessings come from, above. The cross arrangement in his garments, there's a lot of things that I can explain here. The cross arrangements is made by a combination of a downward strip of cloth, which is equivalent to the stole worn by Western and Eastern clergy to this day, if they still dress up for church. That stole is called the epitrachilion. A cross is made when there is a belt put around the entire garment, called the zone, and this is still, again, interesting because it's still worn to this day in Eastern churches. An equally traditional garment is, of course, the Western alb, the white robe with a detached stole, a stole that isn't sewn together in the middle. Now, this particular church appears to have been more Greek or Eastern in its culture than Western, but one more thing I want to point out is the little handcuffs that are at the cuffs of the sleeves. This particular fellow, unlike some of his fellow priests or whoever on the wall here, his fellow saints, if you like, this particular fellow has very small cuffs. Others have very large cuffs. These manacles are also still worn by Eastern higher clergy to this day, bishops, priests, deacons, and it's symbolizing that, and the yoke, the strip of cloth in the middle, symbolizes slavery. You are not allowed to be your own person. You are bound to Christ. You are a slave to Christ. You must do what the church has given you to do, representing Christ and giving the gifts of God to the people of God. So kind of interesting stuff. I don't know how much of that symbolism was fully intact in the 4th century, but to be honest, a lot of it had to be in some form there, because otherwise you wouldn't dress like that. So fascinating stuff when you uncover this. Another interesting point, is for years the British Museum denied that these very religious images from a Christian home were actually, in fact, a worship space, a church. Well, they've finally fixed, don't know how many years ago it was now, but it was within the 21st century that I recall. They fixed the sign to acknowledge that this was a house church. That was kind of a victory for all of us who had been pushing for them to acknowledge that for a while. Okay, lots of things I've given you for you to ask questions about, lots of things to think about, and it's time to sign off. Have a great, well, whatever it is for you, early morning, late night, uh, unique corner of the time-space continuum, and I'll be seeing you in class. Take care.